So you know that feeling when you think you know exactly how something's going to play out, only for it to not just meet, but also exceed every single expectation that you had for it? Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii is that for me. It's been about a year since I played Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and TLDR, that game really built on the foundation that Yakuza Like a Dragon set for itself back in 2020, with fantastic character work, one of the most engaging turn-based combat systems in any JRPG, and the full spectrum of goofy minigames and side content for those that wanted it. To me, it really cemented itself as one of the best games that the studio had come out with. But perhaps most importantly, it marked a turning point for the franchise following a leadership change back in 2021, with both Toshihiro Nagoshi and Daisuke Sato moving on from their decades-long careers at Sega to work on other projects. Infinite Wealth then was a chance for the new brass to really prove themselves worthy of stepping into the shoes of the legendary developers that came before them. And I'd say, without a doubt, they really stepped up admirably. So for a game series that is fundamentally defined and loved for its rampant tonal disconnect, intense melodrama balanced by equally intense but absolutely ridiculous, heartwarming side stories, how on God's green earth does Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii fit into that framework? Pretty well actually, but it definitely took me a while to really warm up to it. You see, initially I thought the game was going to mostly forgo the character drama and self-serious tone of the classic Yakuza titles, with the goal of fully committing to that more over-the-top setting, worthy of having the mad dog of Shimano himself at the helm, and at least at the beginning, that seemed to be true, but as the game progressed, we'll get into it. It returns to the classic beat-em-up formula, reworking Majima's signature combat style in a way that feels a lot more fluid than previous titles, but also adding a new style that is really unlike anything the series has seen before, befitting of the Pirate Yakuza title. And yes, as always, there is a wealth of side content, equal parts ridiculous and heartfelt simultaneously, some borrowed from Infinite Wealth, like Crazy Delivery and Sicko Snap, but some completely new, like some sub-stories that are just, yeah, you know how it goes. Perhaps the best part about Pirate Yakuza, however, is that it manages to somehow weave its absolutely fucking ridiculous premise, Goro Majima becoming the captain of his very own Hawaiian pirate crew, into not just a compelling Yakuza story, but really one of the series' most memorable to date. It really surprised me, and I can't wait to tell you about it. So, where to begin? Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii begins off a small island off the coast of Hawaii, where former vice chairman of the Tojo clan, Japan's leading Yakuza group, Goro Majima, washes ashore after an unknown event, with no recollection of his past or even his name, where he is conveniently saved from a group of legit seafaring pirates by Noah, an asthmatic 10-year-old boy and the son of Jason Rich, a treasure hunter turned barkeep after a mysterious betrayal. It's here that amnesiac Goro Majima commandeers the ship of the very obviously evil Jack the Collector before embarking on a journey to not just find out why the hell he's in Hawaii, but also to show Noah, sheltered by his father for practically his whole life, the wonders of the world outside of the island, or the wonders of Honolulu at the very least. What follows is a swashbuckling adventure in the truest sense of the word. It is a pirate story after all, but the craziest part about all of it is that it's canon. It not only broadens the plot of Infinite Wealth, providing some much needed answers for a couple of things that weren't explained all that well, like Bryce supposedly being over 100 years old, but also functions really well as a standalone game. And I would say that this is almost a perfect jumping in point for newcomers to the franchise. Having a character as emblematic as Majima as an amnesiac means that sometimes impenetrable wall of lore that inevitably comes from playing a story-driven game with 20 years of plot development is largely absent, instead gesturing towards the major story in a way that will please fans of the series without alienating those that are unfamiliar. The story starts off really quite slowly as a way to familiarize yourself with the game's new systems, which there are a lot of, surprising for a game that was supposed to be smaller in scale to the other titles. At least at the start, It really feels quite unserious and goofy, which is completely what I expected given its absurd premise, but to my surprise, it does eventually start to unfurl into what feels like a fully fledged RGG title, and by the end, it's as worthy of the Like a Dragon label as any other game in the series. The actual plot is, as expected, incredibly ludicrous, where Majima and co., the crew of the newly appointed Goro Maru, discover a secret 200-year-old pirate treasure worth a fuckload of money. When taken on its own, it might be a little uninspiring, but keep in mind, this is a Yakuza game. It works really quite well for what it's trying to do, but where the writing really shines, like Infinite Wealth before it, is in its characters. It has a very gloves-off attitude when it comes to how it approaches its characters, and what do I mean by that? Well, it is the first Yakuza game fully focused on Majima himself, and obviously at least a little of that insanity is going to peek through. But even with this, it's clearly not afraid to push the pirate fantasy to its absolute limits, be it spontaneous musical numbers and dance sequences, recurring fights with notoriously useless pirate captains, to fighting giant sea creatures. The writing will consistently keep you on your toes, doubly so when it comes to Majima himself. Majima is broadly a known quantity at this point, but his memory loss acts as a great way to inject some new character development, something notoriously difficult for a character with 20 years of history. He really does come to the table here, not just being a capable and charismatic leader in his own right, but also acting as a really genuinely compassionate mentor to Noah. The bond that forms between the two over the course of the game is really heartwarming, touching on the themes of growth and change that the series has always showcased to a great degree. Speaking of Noah, I'm actually really impressed that RGG were able to have a literal 10-year-old on a pirate ship somehow not manage to be the most annoying motherfucker in the whole world. The way that he talks is just unhinged enough to be genuinely funny, and he definitely has his moments. The ragtag group of pirates really coalesce by the game's conclusion, and Noah really serves as the bedrock foundation for this coming together. The game's villains as well run a casino city inside of a cave off the coast of Hawaii known only as Madlantis. Yes, Madlantis. RGG have always managed to write their villains in a way that seems somewhat sympathetic, yet at times really quite terrifying. This time around, however, they're just evil, and in most cases I would complain about that, but I mean, the story is literally about the vice chair of the Tojo clan becoming a literal pirate captain, for fuck's sake. All in all, I think that this story really needs to be experienced to do it justice. Just know, especially in the game's final 2 chapters, it really does come into a league of its own. It starts to take itself more seriously despite its premise, and the character moments and melodramatic flair that come from that, man, it's as good as ever. It really feels like a swashbuckling adventure by its conclusion, and in that way, marks itself as something significantly different to RGG titles before it. My one complaint about the narrative is that it comes to a complete standstill in Chapter 2, as you're constantly stewarded between different side activities to introduce you to how the game's auxiliary systems work, which was quite frustrating in my opinion. But once you cross that hurdle, the game's pacing does significantly improve. Now, as with any good RGG title, the side content is often as much of a draw as the main story is, and it's no different with this game. While many of the major activities are borrowed almost indistinguishably from Infinite Wealth, the sub-stories and the new activities are a real highlight this time around, especially in the back half of the game once it starts to really open up to you. If you're unfamiliar with RGG games, they'll always have a plethora of side activities that have ridiculous premises, but have a really strong emotional foundation that ties them together in a way that almost always makes them worth experiencing. The contrast between the melodrama of the main story and these really goofy side activities has been the main draw of the series for a lot of people. So naturally, I was pretty curious about how a game that's main focus is its ridiculous premise would handle these stories, and the truth of the matter is that not much has changed here. A couple of these stories are real standouts, and it's clear that they are markedly different to the main plot, but still, something to differentiate them from previous outings would have been nice. And that's not me in any way suggesting that this is somehow bad, by the way. It's as much of a draw to this game as any. It's just that the tonal shift doesn't feel as drastic, which to me at least feels like a key pillar of what makes Yakuza games, well, Yakuza games. Despite this, there is one of these that I do want to talk about because I just thought it was the funniest shit ever. So, after spending a decent amount of time in Hawaii, Majima will eventually stumble across a fellow pirate captain, Brian, at ends with his crew. When you approach them with the intent of finding out what's causing their troubles, the younger crew members will express frustration at the pirates' excessive drinking parties and marked failure at adherence to, get this, corporate compliance, and promptly put in their 2 weeks. Majima, a verified old-timer at this point, man is pushing 60, sits down to console the captain, who tells him that he's having trouble holding on to his younger crewmates, who value fair compensation and clearly defined hours, a far cry from the pirate life. It's here the pair are interrupted by a consultant, White, who was eavesdropping on their conversation and offers compliance training to both Majima and Brian, free of charge of course, and in an effort to better understand the desires of their younger crewmates, they graciously accept. White runs the pair through 2 scenarios, playing out a sequence of events that might take place on the ship, and then asking the two to comment on any compliance issues present in how these situations were handled by those involved. The first plays out in the quarters after the crew have woken up, and the captain says good morning and tells the lads that it's time to get to work. Now, what was wrong there? Was it the fact that Cap was telling them to work as soon as they got out of bed? Nope. It's the fact that he referred to them as lads, and the use of gender-specific language might upset some female crewmates. Scenario 2 finds the fictional crew in battle with a rival crew, and after boarding their ship and killing their captain to steal the pirate booty, the captain congratulates his crew for a job well done, and agrees to split the spoils of their venture between everyone equally as a gesture of goodwill for a battle hard fought and hard won. Majima rightfully protests. What exactly is the problem with that? I'll give you a second to think about it. If you said it's the fact that they literally murdered a rival group of pirates to steal from them, you'd be wrong. The real issue is that splitting the gold equally amongst every crew member doesn't take into account the individual contributions of the people involved. And as we all know, the executive branch of the ship obviously deserves a hell of a total remuneration package. Let's say an easy 25 mil. You know, I think this would somehow be even funnier if it weren't so accurate. Anyway, training is over, so as the group return to land, White is confronted by some disgruntled businessmen who claim that his compliance training has destroyed their company, as the younger staff refuse to work outside of their defined hours or commit to tasks that aren't in their job descriptions and threaten him in turn. White has his very own team though, so a group of thugs is surely no issue, but would you look at the time? It's 5 PM. It's time to clock off. His lackeys, taking their compliance obligations incredibly seriously, return home for the day, leaving White all on his own, where Majima steps up to dispatch the goons. And when all is said and done, White offers to join your pirate crew with the hope of studying the pirate working environment to get a leg up in consulting for scurvy dogs. I found this absolutely hilarious, and I think that's a great point to move on to some of the game's more piratey mechanics. I mentioned that White actually joins your crew after completing the sub-story, and this is far more important than it initially might seem. As you encounter the various denizens of Honolulu and Madlantis, some of them will offer to join your crew in exchange for help with a task or a fight, you get it. These crew members can be assigned specific functions on your ship, manning the cannons or machine guns, to acting as a boarding party when you eventually go toe-to-toe with your enemies. And these people, they actually exist on your ship. You can see them sitting around and talking to one another, and weirdly enough, it really brings this strange sense of continuity to the game that it otherwise wouldn't have. Yakuza titles have always been known for their plethora of quirky characters, but they really have always existed separately from one another. And while they don't really interact here, they just act as set dressing, having a bunch of these characters join you on your adventure makes your ship really feel like a ragtag group, searching for bounties and felling your enemies. It's crazy, right? By the end of the game, my ship was stacked out with ninjas, e-girls, homeless people, polar bears named Stephanie, otakus, Aloe Happy himself, and the 14th best host in Kamurocho. They're characters from all over the series, and they really bring a sense of community to your ship, which does actually become relevant when we talk about the game's combat and encounters. Combat is pretty good, but if you've played any of the beat-em-up style games in this series, you already know that. Majima has two very distinct fighting styles, the first being Mad Dog, which is a play on the style that was introduced in Yakuza 0, with a lot of quality of life improvements, charge attacks, and just an overwhelming feeling of fluidity. Attacks really have weight behind them, and Majima's dagger really adds a lot to the feeling of variety between light and heavy attacks. I'm not going to claim that the combat is somehow revolutionary, it is kind of spammy, but I never got bored over the game's roughly 30-hour runtime. Where Pirate Yakuza really changes things up though is its second style, aptly named Sea Dog, where Majima wields dual cutlasses, a flintlock, and a grappling hook, which is much more focused on chaining together these big AoE style attacks to take out large groups of enemies. And large groups of enemies there are many. Sea Dog was really designed for these encounters specifically. When you board an enemy ship, or in some cases have encounters on islands, you'll be fighting with your crew against groups of up to 100 enemies at a time, and these big AoE attacks are incredibly necessary to your success. Majima can throw his cutlasses like boomerangs while he fights with his fists, and later in the game, you get the ability to summon literal dark gods by playing cursed instruments that you find in your plundering. And I think this is really the major draw when it comes to Pirate Yakuza's combat. It takes the big, bombastic battles that maybe happened only a couple of times in each game prior and makes them almost a focus, at least if you choose to engage with it. The only change I don't necessarily agree with is how heat actions are handled here. They've always been a staple of Yakuza combat, these big flashy moves that can only be pulled off periodically and contextually, and they are still in this game, but its reliance on them is severely diminished. I can see why, as they put a lot of effort into refining the moment-to-moment combat, and it does feel really good, but I just wish they were a little more prevalent. Upgrades are also served a little differently this time around. Instead of relying on experience, you purchase abilities with money, much like it was in Yakuza 0, and they are dished out at a really good pace, I feel. You can never just unlock everything you want at once, but I never exactly felt starved for money. I think RGG really managed to strike a good balance here. Ship combat, however, is definitely a little less impressive in my opinion, but it does serve as some variety over the game's runtime. Most of what you'll be doing is taking out smaller ships as you sail to your destination, which can be done with either your front-facing machine guns or side-facing cannons, which can be swapped out for various different options that are unlockable over the course of the game. Your cannons do the most damage, by a long shot actually, but can have a fairly long cooldown. The main loop in combat then revolves around sailing past these ships, firing your cannons off before circling back around to do it again. The only way for you to avoid enemy attacks really is to just boost past them. It's not all that mechanically deep, but certain attacks can apply status effects to your ship that can disable your weapons or knock out your crew members, which you actually have to walk around on deck to fix up or revive them. And when these systems were actually utilized, I actually found the ship combat quite strategic and engaging, but I can count on one hand the amount of times I actually had to engage with the system. It really feels like a missed opportunity to not expand on this further. If you're facing off against a larger ship, once you've depleted its health bar, you can board them, pitting your boarding party against their crew in a climactic battle. And yeah, these are fun for sure, but they can feel a little samey by the game's conclusion. Look, the ship combat is fine. It really is. If you are looking for a game with really great pirate ship combat, just go play Assassin's Creed Black Flag. It still holds up. You can customize the appearance of your ship as well, which is definitely cool, and there are some upgrades, but they ultimately feel really surface level and never extend beyond minor stat increases. I imagine a world with ship heat actions, more varied weaponry, but because of the game's smaller scope, RGG just decided not to implement stuff like this, and that's okay, I guess. The biggest problem I have with the whole game is actually the open water traversal. Look, the ship controls are fine for combat. I don't really have many issues with it, but when it comes to actually navigating these big open water spaces, it just feels so slow. I really don't understand why RGG thought that this pace felt good to play. It takes absolutely forever to get anywhere. You can fast travel, but only between lighthouses, which you can only do in a menu accessible from those lighthouses specifically. You've been able to fast travel from your map in these games for ages now. It just feels a little incongruent that you can still do it in Hawaii, but not on the water, especially because navigating the ocean is so tedious by comparison. When it boils down to it, practically every issue I have with the game is so minor that it doesn't really matter. Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii really stands on its own 2 feet as not just an off-year spin-off RGG game, but a fully fledged entry into the series in a way that really took me off guard. Its story does take a while to get going, but when it does, it showcases all the best elements of an RGG title while still allowing itself to lean into its absurd premise in a way that never feels too overbearing. It does a really great job with its characters, selling the relationship that forms between its ragtag group of people. The strength of this foundational group means that the reveals, the big emotional moments work really well, and the more unbelievable setting taking center stage in the opening section allows the game to really build up to them. And as such, with practically every RGG title before it, there are some really gut-wrenching emotional moments that tug at the heartstrings way more than I expected. Hawaii is just as compelling of a setting as it was in Infinite Wealth, absolutely nailing that virtual tourism aspect these games revel in. And despite some wonky ship navigation, the islands around often feel just as interesting, providing some welcome variety to the game's setting. Its side content is just as ridiculous as ever, perhaps a little hamstrung by the more unserious tone of the main narrative, but regardless of that, provides a lot of value to those that are looking for a bunch of meaningfully engaging, hilariously presented side stories. And yeah, despite some minor missteps when it comes to ship combat, generally, combat and the game's progression, it's all really solid, building on the foundation set by previous titles, and in the case of Sea Dog specifically, providing some genuinely novel experiences with a level of spectacle seldom seen in these games. Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii really surprised me. My expectation was for this to be a little more than a throwaway spin-off, given the absolute absurdity of its premise, but if there's one thing I'll say about the Mad Dog of Shimano's swashbuckling adventure, it's that I'm really glad to have been proven wrong. Thanks for watching as always. What a crazy video game. Absolutely absurd in all the right ways, but really heartfelt when it needs to be. So as always, like the video if you liked it. Tell me what you think down in the comments. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Anyway, hope you have the best day. Catch you in the next one.